Welcome to the first episode of the Skills Factory, talks and ideas about skills from Europe and beyond. This is the podcast series done by the European Training Foundation. According to UNESCO, by mid-2020, more than 1.2 billion students have stopped having face-to-face classes. Some of them had all necessary technology to keep on the distance learning, but many were unable to learn due to the skills gaps among their teachers or a lack of parental support. At the same time, according to UNICEF, for at least 463 million of school learners worldwide, there was no such a thing as a remote learning. They cannot be reached by digital and broadcast remote technology. The deployment of distance learning has brought new problems and highlighted the existing challenges. The access to digital devices is very unequal. There are significant disparities by socioeconomic and cultural status. So inclusive learning, especially in the post-COVID world, is it a myth or a challenge to be tackled by the countries worldwide?
All of a sudden, teaching and learning are the front line. Teachers are thrown into a light and into a role that is completely different from what we were thinking of a few months ago. This also goes together with recognition that we have a big challenge on inclusion. We have seen in the different countries' responses to the pandemic that inclusion and how to bring in marginalized groups requires a new effort, a new understanding of how we can provide the same level of teaching and learning to all groups when we live through such big transformations.
This was the director of the European Training Foundation, Cesare Onestini, talking about the inclusion and the drastic transformation of the teaching and learning. I'm Lvova, and today we're going to talk about inclusive education and we'll try to understand, is it a myth or a problem to be tackled? So today we're going to discuss different aspects of inclusive education and we'll try to understand, is it a myth or a problem? I'd like to introduce our two amazing guests to talk about the inclusive education. Poornima Luthra, teaching faculty at Copenhagen Business School, and Cristina Mereuta, labor market expert from the European Training Foundation. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Hello.
So, first of all, ladies, let's set up the terminology. What is inclusive learning? How we can define it? Poornima.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. It's a really important topic and one that's very close to my heart, I think, as it is for many educators around the world. As we think about inclusive education, I think it is important to understand, as you rightfully said, what is in fact inclusive education. The way I see it, there are three components when it comes to inclusive education. It has to do with access, quality, and content. Very often, most organizations, educational institutions, government bodies, humanitarian agencies tend to focus on the access and the quality. What we also really need to put on the table more actively is content as well. So let me maybe go through these three items as well. So access is about ensuring that there is equitable and equal access to education across the world, across all children, and in fact, adult learners as well. And then when we come to quality, it is thinking about the materials, the training of teachers, the equipment that's available, school facilities that are available. There's a great disparity in the world when we look at the quality of education and educational facilities. Finally, of course, content. Now, in some parts of the world, we are thinking about, educating our young people for the future, for the fourth industrial revolution. At the same time, in other parts of the world, we're still teaching our young learners, our young children, things that were taught, decades ago. So there's a real need for us to have a full revamp of the content that we're actually teaching young people, so that we're actually preparing them for the future workplaces that they're going to be entering. They're certainly going to look very different from what we were used to. So it's really important for us to prepare them adequately, so that all young people around the world are starting off their working careers on an equal playing field, which right now, that's not what it is.
Thanks a lot, Poornima, for your answer. Cristina, you're working in EU neighboring countries. How we can define inclusive learning there, and what are the differences?
Definitely, we are not short in the EU neighborhood countries of definition of reflection in the strategies of this ideal and objectives of inclusive education. What I think is maybe an unfinished job is to really reflect what it means to build up an inclusive education, a fully fledged inclusive education system. And that means to look at all policy cycle components, from planning, from design and planning, implementation, and most important, I would say, in the monitoring and evaluation components. As Poornima said, I fully agree, it's about access, it's about content, it's about relevance. I would only add here and unpack a bit here that we also, to be fully inclusive, we would also need a permeable education and training system where various learners with specific needs have access to upward educational pathways, so career progressing and so on. And I think an issue for the EU neighborhood countries, why inclusive education is not a full reality yet, is also what you get out of education and training. So this transition to labor market, how much skill set count on the labor market. So this is an aspect to take into account as well. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll definitely come back to this aspect of the labor market. But first, we knew about the challenges of inclusion into education before 2020. They obviously existed. Inclusion of all learners into education and making sure each individual has an equal opportunity that Poornima mentioned. But the COVID-19 pandemic made the differences and problems of inclusion more visible. So how did this global health crisis affect the possibilities to ensure inclusion and equity through the education system? Poornima.
Yeah, I think, it's not that these problems were not there, as you rightfully said. They were certainly there. What this pandemic has done is to highlight it across, and perhaps it has finally received the attention that it should have received maybe some time back. It's also highlighted cracks, some pretty deep cracks in our educational systems, even in the developed world. And I think that that's when, people are starting to pay attention to what education should be and the rights of young people to receive education. So I think the pandemic in that way has actually brought to light many of the things that were already pre-existing issues in our society globally. I do think that the things that it has particularly highlighted are the gender divide, digital divide, and ethnic divide of education. And I think that this is something that we really need to address. As this pandemic seems to be lengthening on, the impact of which is going to be felt, I think, for years to come. We are going to have to make some serious decisions. We're going to have to make some serious policy changes, amendments, in order for us to almost reverse the damage. They're saying that, much of the development or the progress that has been made in the last decade has been erased by this, especially when it comes to education for girls. And that is something that really governments need to be putting on the table as we come out of the pandemic. I do understand governments right now are overwhelmed with managing the pandemic and dealing with the vaccinations, and that's fair enough. But there'll come a point when we need to be actually thinking about the recovery of our society, not just economy. And at that point in time, education really needs to be at the top of that.
Don't you see that this is kind of putting education into light these days? Because we're having all our kids at home. We are all kind of helping them with education process. So in a way, there is more emphasis about and more discussion among the international organizations about the role of education. Don't you think that this is the case?
Yeah, I think certainly. Look, I think there is there are privileged communities around the world where we're sitting and able to have digital education, remote learning for our children. And that's brilliant. That's great that we're living in, some of us are living in these and having these opportunities. At the same time, it's also brought to light the very fact that there are millions of hundreds of millions of children around the world who simply do not have access to these digital platforms. Even in developed countries, we're seeing such a disparity in neighborhoods, in areas where children do not have access, simply do not have enough equipment at home or equipment at all. We're talking about areas of parts of the world where there might be even one maybe smartphone between the family being shared amongst multiple children. There are stories about young people, young girls, traveling 2 hours in India just to be able to get to some place where they can download a print material so that they can bring it back to their villages and study. And that's if they're lucky, right, to be able to continue their education. Many are not able to even do that. So I think, you're right. We've all been, what it's done is it's put every single parent of a child and forced us to think about it, which we may have taken for granted before. Absolutely. But let's not forget that there's a huge disparity in our experiences of education.
Definitely. Cristina, I know that UNICEF and ETF have prepared a report speaking about COVID generation. So we're talking not even about years to come, but we're talking about full generation. From your perspective of your work with the EU neighborhood, how big is that crisis?
Yes, I think it's an outstanding crisis. And actually, we assumed when we developed that research that the crisis would last, let's say, for 1 year, and that slowly to 2021 would be a better year. But now we see that actually the crisis will continue, that actually 2 generations of graduates, of learners and graduates will be deeply affected, and beyond this division that Poornima mentioned, gender, on top of that gender, I would also add the territorial division, urban and rural, which is really prominent in the EU neighborhood countries, going back to the IT infrastructure and digital access and so on. I would also add here the learning losses we see in vocational education and training, because online environment is not fully, adapted. It's not fully responsive to vet needs. But overall, I think in the next couple of years, and this is what UNICEF and ETF study shows as well, is that we need to come up with solution to fill in these gaps, to give a real chance to the future graduates to look at the learning outcomes in terms of, completion, because the online environment, it's a specific one. It doesn't provide the full learning outcomes that we set out in the curricula. And definitely young people mentioned, because the UNICEF and ETF report was based on a huge, wide consultation. Over 15,000 young people responded, adolescents and young people. They really felt scared, These were the maybe, scared concerns. They were not happy with the conditions at home when it comes to learning. They were complaining about the noise, not only the lack of access to devices and so on, but also the noise. But most important, I think what it's most important for us as, researchers or policymakers and so on, they complained about the quality of education. Really, teachers and the education system was not fully prepared for this transition from, face-to-face to online environment. So for many months, the type of assessment, looking at the certification and assessment and grading, they were unhappy, really unhappy. But of course, the countries made a lot of efforts. I think some of the gaps are filled in already. But definitely there is an issue, for example, for children learners with special needs, for those who have a certain degree of disability, and for those that are living in remote areas, in rural areas. This will be an issue in the future as well.
Cristina, well, as we said at the beginning, we are speaking about education overall. No, we're talking about adult education, vocational education. I have a follow-up question to you. So would it be correct to say that vocational education is in a bigger crisis than general secondary education?
Yeah, to some extent, I would say so, yes, because definitely, for example, all dual education arrangement that the EU and ETF and all the countries are really seeking, to promote and to have, on the job trainings and so on, they simply disappeared because of all this suspended, they were suspended because of the health restrictions, mobility restrictions, and so on. So it's really a loss. And actually, in the EU neighborhood countries, vet professions, vet occupations are practically a backbone in the economy. I mean, there are large sectors that are in need of, workforce that it's with vet-specific skills. So I would say that on mid to long-term, the effects will be quite serious. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, because the practical skills are the most difficult to be taught online. So it's a gap, that I guess we will see the results of it in years to come.
Yeah.
My next question is about we've discussed the lack of digital devices for kids to get the online training done properly. I've seen also that a lot of international organizations introduced the term learning poverty. So how this learning poverty can be tackled? Are there already recipes, ideas from different countries? Poornima.
Yeah, I actually wanted to, build on something Cristina said earlier about generations, and then I'll answer the question around, the learning poverty and digital as well. Every generation has something called the generation defining moments, right? So they're pivotal moments that happen in history that work towards defining that generation, the values, behaviors, motivators of that generation as they become adults. And usually these generation defining moments happen at a time in young people's lives where they can remember it and where it has a conscious impact on how they view the world around them. COVID-19, this pandemic, is certainly one of those generation defining moments for both Generation Z and Generation Alpha, right? Generation Z is the generation who has seen exams and, graduations being canceled. They're the generation who have had to graduate through robots in some parts of the world. In Japan, we've seen robots graduating on behalf of them. At the same time, they're also a generation last year when they graduated that had very inspirational talks from Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey and leaders Satya Nadella, and the like of. And so they've seen this pandemic, and it's had a huge impact on them. They've also started joining the workforce through the pandemic, which has in itself been very challenging. Many of them have had to work remotely, and they're also seeing perhaps the benefits of it. So it's going to have a huge impact on how we think about work and work from anywhere, work remotely, and all of those new ways of thinking about the future of work. Now, when it comes to Generation Alpha, they're our youngest learners, right? They're the little ones in our schools, and we are still going to have to see what the impact of this is going to be on them. For me, as I look at young people and the work that I do, I think that one of the key things is social interaction. I think no matter who you speak to, when it comes to young people, they're missing social interaction. And so one of the key learning outcomes, as you rightfully said, Cristina, that unfortunately online learning is just not able to fill, is this social interaction, those social dynamics, those social skill development. And this is a very important one because it is going to have a profound impact. I mean, just think about this for a moment, that there are nursery and kindergarten children around the world that have never stepped into a classroom, that their only experience of education up till this point in time, if they've started through the pandemic, has been online. No playgrounds, no social interactions, no sandpits to play with friends. Their playdates are online playdates with their school friends. That is going to have a huge impact on that generation. And I think that that's something we have to be very conscious as we come out of, and how to help the mental health, the social health of these young people. So I'll come back to answer your question now.
Just to interrupt you, but I guess there will be all positive and negative impacts of those alpha generation, because they will lack social interactions, but they will definitely be a digital nomads.
Oh, absolutely. But I wonder, honestly, if they would have been a digital nomad regardless, right? They're living in a world that anyway they would have picked up those skills. But you're right. There will be some positive impact about this. They will be looking at work differently. Remember, generations are, 15 to 20-year periods, right? So, the oldest of them will see their parents working at home, and they're going to realize that, hey, I don't really need to be working in an office and working for these number of hours. I can work more flexibly. So, they're going to be able to see some, we're going to see some positive things, certainly. But I think it's important to address the negatives so that we can actually hold on to some of those positives as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So coming back to your question, right, that you asked earlier, what is needed for this kind of learning poverty that we are facing right now in the world? I think that it is crucial for public-private social partnerships. I think that is one of the key things that we need to put on the table, that we actually can't achieve the goals that we want to achieve without these three groups coming together. So public organizations, of course, deeply invested in this. Organizations like the ETF and UNESCO, of course, it's at the forefront of their agendas. It's at the forefront of what they do. What we also need to see is private organizations stepping up and doing the right thing, right? Their corporate social responsibility to ensure that the talent pipeline for the future is indeed a talent pipeline that is well prepared and well equipped and well educated. I think that's part of the social responsibility that private sector organizations need to be doing. And finally, it also requires social involvement. So what I mean by social, I'm talking about societies, communities, parents, teachers, all of that community to come together in order to work with both the public sector and private sector to really put their thinking hats on. This has been a disruption in education. No educator likes to teach online, quite frankly. And so it needs all of us educators to really put this hat on. It needs parents to rethink what education should look like. It needs us to really, have all these three stakeholder groups working in partnership.
Cristina.
Yeah, I would only add here that definitely the poverty in education was visible before COVID, but now it's more visible. And I think what the risk we see here is that certain groups that were really exposed, and even now they're in a worse situation, would somehow, disappear or be less visible in this, given the magnitude of the impact. Definitely, I think the countries should invest in closing the digital gaps, not only when it comes to children, young learners, or young adults, but most important, I think also in the parents, teachers, and all the various sectors that are involved in education and training. In certain countries, there are efforts to somehow provide remedial classes. So to help those, as soon as the situation normalizes and education can resume in an face-to-face format, to help those that are those learners that were, I don't know, for example, they were not able to connect to the online classes, or they have this kind of independent way of learning was not, fit for them. What I would maybe add here is that, for example, the ETF partner countries, some of the ETF partner countries have invested in, for example, early warning mechanism on school disengagement, because what we see now, it's a big risk of kind of invisible, silent school disengagement. Why I'm saying that? Probably only in 1 year or in a couple of years, we will really see the effects of the crisis. We will see probably a jump in early school leavers. But because the statistics is done in such a way with a certain time lag, we will only see in 2 years' time, probably. Therefore, the countries like Montenegro that invested in this kind of connecting various administrative database, or investing in this early digital, it's a digital-based early warning mechanism about children that are not performing, that they are absentees, and so on. This helps them now to address exactly these emerging vulnerabilities and school exclusion.
That's an excellent example. So once the system alarms school or parents, they can take some steps to avoid even bigger damage, right?
Exactly, and they can allocate additional resources. Of course, when you look at this pattern of poverty, social exclusion, and education disengagement, school disengagement, these are really clearly connected. Therefore, they are using this system also to work on in certain deprived communities, be it in certain regions that are more less lagging behind in terms of economic development or opportunities. So it's really a useful system, and many other countries are trying to use at this kind of integrated socio-economic analysis of main indicators. I think in this crisis we also need to add up when it comes to indicators, what are we looking at? Well, I mentioned the issue of monitoring and evaluation. Shall we look only at retention and access and retention rates in education? No, we really need to look at also the content, the relevance, and also the risk of disengagement. But we need to look also at additional indicators like the social status, the social impact, and labor market, and so on. So really there is a time to boost a bit the research, particularly in our partner countries. In the advanced economies, I saw more kind of, updated research on the social impact, but definitely in our countries, there is a need to boost this availability of statistics, and most importantly, the usage of data sets and really evidence policy making, evidence-based policy making.
Thanks a lot, Cristina. I think it was an excellent story from EU neighborhood on how problems can be tackled. But now I'd like really to go to the question that is in the title of this podcast. So there is an idea that inclusion is just about people accepting other people. But in reality, the real inclusive learning means a big effort from all involved parties. No? Poornima already said about involvement of private companies and public bodies. So how can the inclusive learning be reached? And is it possible at all? Poornima.
I'm a bit of an idealist, always have been, and an optimist. So, and when you're an educator, I think that you hope and pray that these things are realities that can be reached one day. Maybe not in our own lifetime, but I do hope that one day, education will be as inclusive. And you're right, it involves many different things. It's about ensuring that there's inclusive education at a gender level, that there is inclusive education when it comes to digital access, when there's inclusive education across ethnicities, when there's inclusive education across neurodiverse needs and ways of learning. So there's really so many aspects that need to come together to really truly be an inclusive or have an inclusive education across the world. And I can understand why some would think that it's a myth. It seems, we're close to 8 billion people around the world. We have, 1.5 billion children who have been affected by this pandemic at the peak of it in April, and continue to be, right? We're still seeing about 900 million children still being affected by this. So we are, it seems daunting, and I can understand the skepticism around the myth. But at the same time, don't we owe it to ourselves to be able to move the needle on this? We owe it to our children, to our grandchildren, because we want to leave the world a little bit better than it was for us. And I think that, if we keep that in mind, at least that will provide that vision and motivation to keep at it. Whether we actually achieve it in our lifetimes or not, I don't know. I'd like to think that we would.
Thanks a lot, Poornima. Thanks, indeed. Hopes us then, we owe it to our children for sure. Cristina.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite optimist. I mean, I see these steps for inclusion in many EU member states, and I see that it takes maybe 10 years, it takes maybe 20 years, but in the end, you can reach a kind of decent level of inclusive education, measured by really clear targets and so on. And I think the EU neighborhood countries are performing quite well when it comes, for example, in closing these gaps when it comes to access to primary and lower secondary education. This is what Torino process rounds have shown, that even there are huge issues with resources, huge economic problems or poverty problems, the participation in education has improved consistently. Of course, there are issues with the participation of adults, upskilling and reskilling, but when we look at the initial education, I think there are huge progresses. What I think we need to understand, all of us, is that the term of inclusion per se is very complex, and actually it includes not only education, it includes a kind of combined planning and of various policy strands. So various policy strands contribute to inclusive education. Just to mention, all these social services, the developments, availability, support to parents, labor market policies play a role, taxation, infrastructure development, so on. And we see with the COVID crisis that even the digital infrastructure plays a huge role when it comes to inclusion or exclusions. What I will only recall here is the need for partnership. I mean, there is no way of promoting inclusive education only by the state or only by the private or only, at the individual. I would maybe mention that in the case of EU neighborhood countries, ETF partner countries, beyond state authorities, local or central level, and beyond companies, I think also the non-governmental organizations play a huge role, and particularly in what it's really very much needed in future, the social interaction, mental support that Poornima mentioned. In many of our partner countries, the public school are not yet enough resource to provide such type of services or support. Therefore, the non-governmental organizations, youth organizations are already taking up this role. And the last point is about resourcing. I mean, really, looking at the strategies and the ambitions, the goals and the targets, they are so ambitious, and maybe that's why you ask us if inclusive education is a myth. It's not a myth, but if it's not properly resourced, it remains a dream.
So let's say that in the EU neighborhood there is an awareness, but maybe not that much the vision and the how to proceed with actions in order to achieve this inclusion, correct?
To some extent, I think the how to is clear, the vision is clear. The problem is our resources for objective reasons. I mean, we look at the economic competitiveness, the resources available. That's why also in the EU neighborhood, the donors, the EU investment and funding plays and should play a huge role in future in the recovery. So if we want to promote a human-centered recovery after this crisis, to really invest in human development and skills and all these remedial actions, definitely the EU neighborhood would need the donor support, the EU support, because the state budgets, public budgets are rather insufficient.
Thanks a lot, thanks. Well, actually, we reached our time, and I just would like to finish with one quote, one phrase done by 3 American researchers on inclusive education. They said, "We will know that inclusive education has really become embedded in our culture when the term becomes obsolete." So the pathway is long and not an easy one, but I think we will all work towards it. And I'd like to thank our guests today, Poornima Luthra from Copenhagen Business School and Cristina Mereuta from European Training Foundation. And I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this podcast and stay tuned because there is more to come. Thank you.